So this is going to be a bit of a complicated one. Today I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Venezuela. And the reason I want to do this is I came across a video called How Socialism Killed Venezuela by FreedomToons. In full disclosure, I have watched this video a few times to go through the arguments, and I've prepared a number of articles and quotes to help support my argument and streamline the process of going through this, because this is a very complicated and nuanced issue that ties a lot into economics. I am trying to debunk this video first and foremost and show that the socialism that this person presents, is a straw man at best and does not represent the true causes of what happened in Venezuela. I also want to provide a disclaimer that I'm not trying to, for any way, shape, or form, determine whether or not Chavez or Maduro are good figures or bad figures, or apply any judgment onto them. I think that that's kind of out of the scope of what I'm trying to accomplish here. I am an anarchist. I know states can be corrupt. I know leaders can be corrupt. I know a lot of things goes on behind the scenes, and a lot of people attempt to do good things while also having selfish motivations. I can't apply any of that. I wasn't in any of their heads, and so I am trying to remove that part of the argument and just deal with the idea of socialism in Venezuela in particular. So with that said, let's take a look at the video. So before we even get into the video itself, I want to take a look down at the sources. We see that all of the sources are coming from Mrs.org, which, if we examine from media bias, it is a right-wing organization that is mixed in terms of factual reporting, which I think makes the video's arguments a little bit suspect to begin with. So that said, let's actually go into the video.
Venezuela. No one wants to take responsibility for it. We've heard time and time again that it's not fair to judge socialism based on the performance of Venezuela's economy.
So that is a very true statement. And Fox News, of all sources, agrees with me. Because as we see in a 2010 published article, Fox News writes that private sector still dominates Venezuelan economy despite Chavez's crusade. In fact, the private sector still controls 2/3 of Venezuela's economy. The article further goes on to say that at the balance between public and private sectors remains nearly identical to when Chavez took office, in part because the private sector grew faster than the government between 2003 and 2006, when the economy was booming. Last year, the private sector accounted for 70% of the gross domestic product, including 11% in taxes paid on products, according to central bank estimates. The public sector was 30%, a slightly smaller share than when Chavez was elected in 2008. So what this tells me is that this is not socialism. Maybe it was a state that Chavez wanted to push in the direction of socialism. That's possible. But what socialism means, in every understanding I have, in every definition I have ever read, it is when the workers control the means of production in a society. And the little nuance that I might add is that the workers could also democratically elect a state that controls the economy, though that's not really my particular definition. But even if I gave that particular definition to him, a lot of conservatives tend to believe that Chavez, whether this is true or not is irrelevant, was a dictator who used democracy as a facade in order to maintain his power and rule. And therefore, you can't have it both ways. Either it's a socialist state or it's not. Either the workers control the means of the production or they don't. And while I would argue that Venezuela has a lot of left-leaning policies, and policies that would probably be in a socialist state, I would not argue that it had gone far enough to be socialist at this time, even with the Socialist Party pushing for that in power.
Or the economy of any other socialist state, for that matter.
And here we kind of get like a subtle nod that he gets to determine who a socialist state is, as if it's the generally accepted capitalist definition of any state that controls the economy and takes away the capitalist liberties that is private property. And the fact is, when I think of a truly socialistic or communistic development, I tend to think of 1936, the Catalonian anarchists, right? The Around the time of the Spanish Civil War. I tend to think of that where they've seized the means of production and they own the land and it's collectively shared and all this other stuff. And that might even be further than what a lot of people would define as socialism, but it's certainly more socialistic than anything that is being described here. I don't think that when you have a state power that is authoritarian, which a lot of conservatives again would argue that Chavez was, that you can call that socialism because it creates two different class distinctions, one which is the state class and one which is the working class. And therefore, without the state being accountable to the people, you cannot in any way declare that a socialist state.
And whenever a socialist state fails, the argument is inevitably made that this was because they either weren't really socialist
Which they're
or
not.
fell due to factors outside of their socialism.
So here's the thing. Venezuela, again, in its complicated story and narrative, it actually was influenced by a lot of outside factors. And I'm not saying that the economy or the tactics that were performed by leaders or people within the Venezuelan government couldn't have been better. I don't know for sure. But what I am arguing is that outside factors were probably a greater influence, as I will show, than just the fact that it was a socialist country.
And while no nation in the real
Which, again, I don't necessarily believe it was a socialist nation, but going by this guy's definition.
world can perfectly match a theoretical ideal, Venezuela is about as close to socialism as a country can get.
No, it's not.
In fact, Venezuela's government either meets or comes very close to meeting each of the 10 tenets of.
So what he's doing here, and just to contextualize this, I know I cut it off early because he goes off into something else, but these 10 points are supposed to be 10 points that Marx uses in the Communist Manifesto to define how we should examine a socialist state, according to him. And he gives 10 points that are extremely close or identical to the socialist ideal in his perspective that is supposed to somehow define socialism as this in Venezuela. So even though socialism literally is, do the workers control the means of production? Yes, then you're socialist. I'm willing to give him this. Let's go through this a little bit. And I'm only going to go through half of them because honestly, to go through all of them with everything else I know I have to say and everything that else that has to go on would be just too long and too exhausting. So I picked 5 that I know are simple. Feel free to look up and find out whatever information about the remaining 5 if you feel so inclined to. But number 1, the abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purpose. Now, basically, when I read this, it kind of reads like, get rid of landlords. Make sure people own the land or that they work on, or that people collectively own the land that people work on. And he says the Venezuelan government has expropriated over 6 million acres of farmland and has begun usurping large supermarket chains and factories. And while the factories and supermarkets are true and largely were the appropriation of unused or misused factories as well as foreign-controlled factories, I can't speak to the 6 million acres, but I will give him farmland was appropriated. However, we run into a bit of a problem when the Wall Street Journal cites in 2011, in the first paragraph here, Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez signed a new rental law into effect over the weekend, that obliges landlords to sell their property to tenants of more than 20 years at state-mandated discounts based on how long the space has been rented. Now, for me personally, this doesn't come off as radical to me. If you've lived in a place for 20 years and it's become your home and you've basically made it your own, I think you should have the right to own it. And even if you disagree with me, there's 2 things going on here. One, the tenant still has to buy the property. Yes, it's at a state-mandated discount, but they still have to purchase it. It's not being completely removed. It's not being handed to the person. They have to purchase it. Second of all, there's a landlord who is renting to tenants. And if you've lived in a space for 19 years or less, that person has every right to own that property and to rent it to you, according to this. And I know a lot of capitalists are going to talk about, oh, they're stealing property, they're stealing property, they're stealing property. That's fine. But at the end of the day, the argument is there are landlords. Therefore, this is not socialism. It misses the mark completely on the first definition. A good number of people are living under some sort of rent system. So number 2, we have a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. I don't know what to say to that because the United States has a progressive tax. Right? The United States literally has a progressive tax. United States progressive tax system. The overall federal tax system is progressive, with total federal tax burdens a larger percentage of income for higher income households than for lower income households. Not all taxes within the federal system are equally progressive. The individual and corporate income taxes and the estate tax are all progressive. Is he implying that the United States is somehow socialist? Because I'd argue taxes are just a pretty standard thing in any developed and certainly most developing nations. Number 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance. So the government still taxes the largest inheritances at a hefty rate of 55%. Again, I'm going to pick a straw here, but abolition of all rights of inheritance doesn't mean 55% tax. Tax doesn't mean socialism. And furthermore, that rate is probably a progressive rate, if I had to imagine, that the 55% is only coming from the highest bracket and not going throughout. So from there, I'm going to skip a few, and I'm going to go down to number 8. Equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Maduro signed a forced labor law requiring all workers to help the government boost food production. So, as I'm going to show, there's a complicated economic thing that happens within Venezuela that causes food production to drop significantly, and the value of food to fluctuate in very bizarre ways. So, Maduro doing this and requiring people to produce food to presumably prevent the population from starving is probably a good thing. It sucks that it has to be forced on a lot of levels, but you're trying to maintain that. And I would even argue to say that even though I haven't researched it completely, it would not surprise me if they were taking unemployed people or people out of work and putting them in these places to try to provide some sort of sustenance for the country. It makes sense on some level. But I'll also say that it doesn't meet any of the requirements because equal liability of all to labor means equal liability of all to labor. All people have to be equally working. And the problem is there's a bourgeois class that controls the private sector. There's 2/3 of the economy being run by a private sector. And if you have that, then there's clearly bourgeois capitalists existing in the country and not providing their labor for the agriculture. Skipping to number 10, free education for all children in public schools. And he goes on to say, public schools in Venezuela function as indoctrination centers where millions of youth read the works of communist figures like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. And I'm going to be real with you, I don't think indoctrination is free education, first of all. And second of all, is he implying that free education is a bad thing? Because that's another one we have in the United States. So, again, what is the implication of that? I don't know. I don't think these match up. I think that these are generally not enough to identify it as socialism, even in his own definition. I think they're pretty weak arguments. And you're citing one example for each of them that doesn't even seem to match up with the ones that I've picked out.
Of a socialist government that Marx lays out himself in the Communist Manifesto. So, if Venezuela is clearly a socialist state,
not so clear, and probably not.
How can Marxist practices not be in any part to blame for its collapse?
Because it's a lot more complicated than that. Even if it was a Marxist socialist state, it's a lot more complicated than that.
One of the main arguments cited by apologists is that Venezuela isn't collapsing due to socialism, rather its dependence on oil in lieu of serious
Yes,
losses
that
in
is
the
exactly
average cost
why.
per barrel. It's true that the cost of oil has dropped immensely, but how much of the failure of the state of Venezuela can be attributed to this? Well, not only is Venezuela not the largest exporter of oil, it isn't even the most oil
Go back a second.
immensely, but how much of the failure of the state of Venezuela can be attributed to this? Well, not only is Venezuela not
So he's talking here that this is the largest oil exporters, but this is irrelevant. How much oil Venezuela is exporting is completely irrelevant compared to how much of its particular total exports it makes up. So I have a statistic for that I can pull up right here. So this is as of 2019. The oil of Venezuela comprises 95% of its exports and 25% of its gross domestic product. And remember that this is going to be something important to look at later. In the first half of 2014, oil prices hovered between $100 and $125 per barrel. So imagine you have $100 and $125 per barrel, 95% of your exports are dependent on this, and those numbers, 100 or 125, just tanks. What is that going to do to your economy? What is that going to do to a quarter of your gross domestic product when that's suddenly losing value? Your economy is going to suffer. Your economy is going to suffer greatly. It's probably going to go into recession. So, given that,
not the largest exporter of oil, it isn't even the most oil-dependent nation. It ranks in 8th place for that.
I don't know where he's getting the numbers for this particular graph. This is talking about PIB, which is the initials for the GPD in Spanish, and he has Venezuela at I think about 8 to 9%, somewhere in that range, if I'm looking at this correctly. Where my information as of 2019 had it at 25%, which puts it closer to Oman and Iraq. And I don't know what to make of these numbers or what year this is supposed to be because he doesn't have that information on the screen. But what I will say is even if it was just 9% or 8% of the annual exports, that's still a significant chunk of money that a nation, especially a developing nation, would lose in that process.
Yet, according to the IMF, of the 15 largest oil exporting countries, Venezuela's economy has tanked more dramatically and persistently than any other.
So he's about to make the argument, and I'm just going to throw it out there, that Venezuela here is the only one that's in the recession through 2014, 15, and 16. And while that is a true statement, it's the only one in the negatives for all that time. A lot of these nations that are here do spend some time in the negatives for a small amount of time. And certainly if they're over the course of a year, the definition of recession is that it has to be usually for 2 quarters. So all of these nations, whenever they hit the negative, it's probably a good bet to say that they were in a recession for a period of time. Furthermore, countries like Angola and Kazakhstan, even though they don't spend all of their time in recession, have much slower economic growth during a lot of these periods. And what that means is that the economy is shrinking, right? Like your growth, not that your economy is completely shrinking, that would be in the negatives, right? But like the amount that your economy is growing slows. And when that happens, that can have a very similar effect to an actual recession. And so it can also predict a recession, by the way. And Angola, I believe, ends up in a recession not long after this trend. And it's convenient to me that 2016 is kind of missing off of Angola for this particular chart. And I don't know where the source for this is in particular. I'm assuming it's from the sources that he provided at the beginning of the video. But I don't know specifically where this came from. And I'm just trying to use his numbers to show that. And furthermore, each of these countries has their own geopolitical status that's different and unique. And just because Venezuela happens to be the one that tanked does not mean that it's because of socialism. Again, correlation is not causation, and the burden of proof of causation is on him in this video.
In fact, it's the only country in the group which was in recession through 2014, 2015, and 2016. For years, Venezuela's economy seemed to be doing okay. But this was illusory. See, when an economy grows, that can be because they're making more good stuff, or it can be because the stuff they already have is increasing in value.
So that's going to be an important point to consider. The two reasons why you would have growth in an economy is either you're making stuff, according to him, or the value of the stuff you already have is increasing. And what happens in Venezuela is the second one. He admits that, and I agree with him. And that is actually part of an economic principle that we'll look at very shortly.
The latter was the case in Venezuela. Under socialism, there wasn't as much incentive for individuals to invest in harvesting more oil.
So when he says that there wasn't as much incentive to invest in oil for individuals, the state actually ran the oil industry, and the state would sell bonds, and those bonds would fuel and pay for the state-run institutions, like the oil industry. So I'm not entirely sure what he's getting at there. It just seems to be a throwaway line to attack socialism.
Or for workers to be more productive.
And this line, the workers being more productive, is kind of a scapegoat, right? Because I'm going to explain to you what actually was going on in the economy. So if we look here, there's a concept in economics called the Dutch disease. And you can pause it and read it if you'd like. But I'm pointing out that Venezuela is listed as a place that has had this occur. So the Dutch disease, it was developed as a concept based in 1959, where the Dutch had found a huge natural gas field. And in that, they started exporting all of that gas. And what it did is it raised the currency of the Dutch. And as that currency appreciated and went up, the other products in the country were not able to be exported because their value increased. People from other nations didn't want to pay the increased price of what those products cost, right? So when you have that situation happen, you start having to import a lot of your goods because you're less incentivized to produce those goods. You start wanting to produce more into gas, which is the one thing that is actually selling on the market, and you might have a reduction in all other resources in the economy. So you might need to import certain things because it's actually cheaper to import them than to produce them in your own country because you can't sell them elsewhere. And it ends up creating a situation where you become completely dependent on outside sources and the one product that you're able to sell. Now, when the price on that falls and the bubble bursts and your economy shrinks, what happens? Well, you end up in either a slower growth or a recession, which is what happened to the Netherlands, a capitalist country. And as it says here, Venezuela went through this exact same process, and it's the process that he describes in the video.
This was seen in other areas of the economy as well. Steel production, for example, fell by more than 70% after it was nationalized in 2008.
So the steel industry was indeed nationalized in 2008, like he says. The production rates did decrease, mostly because it was harder to get some of the resources into the country to actually get to the factory, and so it wasn't operating at maximum capacity. Like, it wasn't at its absolute best. I can't disagree with him on this. All I can say is that the emphasis that he puts on nationalization here, as if it's such a bad thing, we have that concept in the United States as well. There's plenty of cases where eminent domain is claimed. In fact, most recently and famously, Trump ended up calling for the eminent domain of people's personal property, i.e. their homes, and the land on their homes, to help build the border wall. And so this kind of thing happens in a lot of nations. It's not unique to socialism or something, like he's saying. And maybe the extent that Chavez had done it is kind of going towards the socialist goal, but it's not unique to socialist nations either.
Wait, So their oil supply stayed at about the same level, even shrinking a bit. And this was masked by the fact that the price of oil was increasing. But unfortunately, prices didn't increase forever. Thing is, even when oil prices were at an all-time high, the Venezuelan government lacked funds. But like a good socialist state, they refused to stop spending.
So this is a really complicated thing because when you have a nation in the developing world, there is a problem when you have that kind of growth from a single product. That money, you want to spend it on the poor for humanitarian reasons. You want to spend it on the people who need it for humanitarian reasons. But even from an economic sense, it can make sense to devote that to social welfare programs because if you're in a generally developing nation, which tends to have a larger percentage of people below the poverty line, you want to bring them up to that point so they can actually be functional workers and well fed. Workers need to be fed, even in capitalism, right? Like workers need to be fed. That's why the United States has food stamps. That's why there's welfare programs in most of the developed world. We tend to think of these social programs as good things, typically, unless this person doesn't. And again, as a developing nation, you need to protect your workers. And if you're actually trending towards socialism and you have this boom in the economy, you want to share that wealth with people.
So they monetized their debts, flooding the economy with extra cash and creating a crisis of hyperinflation. As a result, people are now starving in the streets, struggling to have their most basic needs met and suffering in other ways most of us living.
So this comes off to me as really ingenuine because if you really cared about these people, he would actually be talking about some of the sanctions and policies that the Trump administration has put on that I'll be going to be talking about in a little bit, and how they have actually harmed Venezuela. But I think it's just a call to emotion and an appeal to emotion so that we just associate socialism with the negativity of starvation and hunger, as if those things didn't exist in capitalism, and as if it wasn't a necessity for some people to go through that. And while I do also think that the people of Venezuela had a really bad deal in all of this and really got hurt, and discussing all this theory is not going to fix any of that or make any of their lives better with what a lot of them have had to go through, I think that it's also important to point out that I really think he's being disingenuous here.
In developed and free nations may never understand. These kinds of mishaps are the inevitable result of central planning.
Here we go.
A market economy isn't perfect, but it allows for people
Capitalism is amazing, and everybody can all do
accumulate
and everybody can do all the things. And even though it's not perfect, we're generally just amazing. There's actually a book that I am looking to read pretty soon. I've heard really good things about it, called The People's Republic of Walmart, that actually develops an understanding that Walmart uses a planned economy within the capitalist structure and actually thrives because of it. And I don't know the details because I haven't read it yet, but as a basic premise, I feel like that's enough to just kind of call this into question. And it just seems like the sycophantic, capitalism good, socialist bad, and blah, blah, blah. Like, it's the same stuff we hear all the time.
manage large supplies of them, whether it be oil, steel, food, or any other important resource. Under socialism, management of precious resources is left up to whomever happens to be empowered by a whimsical and politically operating state to oversee production.
As if, a corporation, like in the United States, maybe in 2008, couldn't have actually tanked the economy by having really, really bad practices at running it. Does that ever happen, like in 2008? I maybe not, I don't know. In 2008, when we had the Great Recession, when our economy completely crapped out and the government had to do that because an arbitrary leader in a corporation can't do the same thing as an arbitrary person in a state potentially messing up. Just saying.
And mismanagement almost always ensues. The resulting chaos eliminates countless human lives and creates more unnecessary human suffering than can be quantified.
Because none of that happens under capitalism either. This is just an appeal to the emotions and to a lot of the fear.
When bearing witness to this kind of injustice, Don't allow proponents of the theories which led to it to fall back on the cop-out that it wasn't real socialism.
It wasn't.
This is cold comfort to the millions who were promised a Marxist utopia just a few years ago and are now eating family pets just to stay alive. And it'll be cold comfort to you if you let them destroy your country.
Oh, look at that, the fear-mongering. You let them destroy your country. They're coming for you next, them socialists. You know, it's just a fear tactic. And this whole video has been that. But given that, I want to kind of break down some of what actually happened with Venezuela and how it happened. And I'm sure there's better versions out there. You know, an economist could probably do it a lot better than me. But from my understanding, right? So what I see happened is that back in the day when Venezuela discovered oil, they ended up having it as a huge part of their economy for years and years and years and years. And, you know, to the point where you have like this 95% of the Venezuela's exports are from the oil industry. And as we've seen, capitalist nations can end up in this kind of bubble also, like with the Netherlands with their gas thing. I have a OPEC actually shows that 99% of the exports are actually from oil in Venezuela. And I don't know what the difference between these two things is. Maybe it's the year difference. But yeah, we know about the Dutch disease. I went over that. So remember I had mentioned about the $100 a barrel? If you read here, highlighted, too much oil caused the global price to drop to $26 in 2016. Today, in this article, 2017, it hovers around $50, which means Venezuela's income has been cut in half. So the price went from $100 a barrel in 2014 to $26 in 2016. So what happened that ended up putting too much oil into the global market? Because this sounds like a factor that is outside of Venezuela's control. And if you look at it, conveniently in 2014, presented by the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the United States oil production growth in 2014 was largest in more than 100 years. So, given that, and given that we have from Investopedia, spurred by the negative effect of high oil prices on their economies, countries such as the US and Canada increased their efforts to produce oil. In the US, private companies began extracting oil from shale formations in North Dakota using a process known as fracking, which of course has become a hot issue within the 2020 election. Meanwhile, in Canada, they started extracting oil from Alberta's oil sands. So we have in 2014 that fracking is used in the United States to pump out a bunch of oil. And as you can see down here, Saudi Arabia actually contributed to the oil problem because they decided that they were going to leave a lot of oil in production to drive the price down in order to try to push the US and Canada out of the market, thinking it wouldn't be valuable enough for them. However, had they held on to some oil, a lot of the OPEC nations might have actually been better off. Would that have saved Venezuela? I don't know. You know, I can't predict that reality. But the US clearly had an influence on damaging OPEC and the entire situation in Venezuela. Furthermore, we end up finding that within the United States, at the same time, the Obama administration starts putting sanctions on Venezuela. And they're mostly for singular individuals. But by 2017, when Trump is in office, the Trump administration on Friday restricted Venezuela's ability to borrow money from American creditors, a prohibition intended to starve President Maduro's troubled government of much-needed cash. So what we're seeing happen here is in 2014, a U.S. tactic upsets OPEC, which ends up tanking the economy of Venezuela. And now, when Venezuela needs aid and assistance so their people don't starve to death, Trump is actually preventing any influx of cash from investors to go into the United States, from the United States into Venezuela. And further, when we enter into 2019, the US ends up targeting it even more by actually advocating for a coup, by saying the Trump administration recognized Mr. Guaido, the 35-year-old leader of the National Assembly, as his supporters took to the streets to demand new elections. Mr. Maduro has cut ties to the United States and has demanded that all American diplomats leave the country. So basically, because if they want any aid, they have to install a US chosen leader. And there's a rich history of this happening in the United States and trying to influence the politics of Latin America to create favorable situations for US corporations to go into Latin America. Whenever there's ever been a socialist movement or any sort of radical progressive movements in Latin America, there's almost always a CIA coup following right behind it. And when the US did what they did in 2014, do I think that they purposefully were targeting Venezuela? Yes and no. I think that the evidence points to the fact that they probably would have had some state understanding that they were damaging Venezuela, as well as every other OPEC nation. However, I don't know if they figured that they would hit Venezuela quite as hard as they did. I don't have any evidence to show that. I can't believe for a second that with the level of intel that the US government has, that we didn't have some idea that something would happen. And I'm not trying to go out there and just call conspiracy either, because the evidence, but once you see this, there is evidence to show that given the disadvantaged position that Venezuela ended up in, the US government has decided to use a tactic of a coup to try to incentivize the privatization of Venezuela and the removal of the socialist elected leaders from power. And no matter how you believe in Chavez or any of this socialist rhetoric, it's clearly evident that what this person promoted in their video is not necessarily true, that there is a very, very complicated and convoluted economic principle in which this happened and has happened to capitalist nations in the past. This wasn't set in stone for socialism. It wasn't the isolating factor that it looks like, especially when a capitalist nation like the Netherlands could have gone through something similar in its history. I think that Venezuela's position as a developing nation left it at a very disadvantaged position in all of this, where it saw Saudi Arabia and the United States' actions and Canada's actions as great influences on its economy when it didn't really have the control to deal with it. And because of its position as a developing nation, it was essentially stuck in a place of having to try to support the majority of its people. And again, I do think it was trying to move towards socialism, but it wasn't there. Socialism was not from my perspective, was not involved in the reason why the economy crashed. I think there's a lot of good economic theory behind it. I'm sure there's a lot of economists that could do a lot better than what I did at explaining this. And what I really hope is that this is the start of a conversation rather than the conclusion of it. And with that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you've enjoyed this video.